full-time consultant since 1991 and has led numerous major planning projects in North America, Australia, and New Zealand. Jarrett grew up in Portland, Oregon, during the era when Portland first made its decisive commitment to be a city for people rather than cars, and began his career as an intern with Portland's transit agency, TriMet. He went on to complete a BA at Pomona College in California and a PhD in theater arts and humanities at Stanford University. In this diverse career, he has written peer-reviewed articles and publications as varied as the Journal of Transport Geography and Shakespeare Quarterly. In addition to his consulting, teaching, and speaking, he writes about public transit issues on humantransit.org. His new book is Human Transit, entitled Human Transit, How Clearer Thinking About Public Transit Can Enrich Our Communities and Our Lives. It's been published by Island Press and is now available for you to purchase. And in Human Transit, Jarrett suggests that to make transit debates less difficult and confusing, we need to return to the essential features of transit, the geometry of line, network, and frequency that all transit technologies share. Many great mistakes in both transit planning and transit-oriented development have been the result of ignoring these fundamentals. Jarrett proposed new approaches to transit decision-making that start with the real questions that transit asks about a community's values. So with that, would like to introduce Jarrett, and thank you, Jarrett, very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Joel. It's great to be here. What I will do here is crash through a presentation that probably takes about half an hour, and then I want to get as quickly as possible into discussion, since that's so often the fun part. As Joel mentioned, I have a good deal of literary and philosophical training, and that means I'm the sort of consultant who, I'm usually the one person in the room who's saying things like, wait a minute, what's the question? What are we really trying to do? What does it all mean? And so I thought I'd start with the question of what is the question? Because when we listen to transit debates, when we listen to noisy, angry people going back and forth at each other in the newspaper, what they usually have is not different answers to the same question, but rather answers to different questions. They're thinking about different questions and therefore have different answers. And I think that in the transit industry in particular, we suffer from a lack of consensus about what the question is. Now, if you just read your average your average newspaper, and especially, this is very important, if you're just a citizen who's just starting to pay attention to public transit issues, you are going to get an overwhelming impression from the media that this is the question, that the question is technology choice. Do we like streetcars? Do we like light rail or buses? Or do we like bus rapid transit? Do we like monorails? This whole debate about this huge well of feeling about emotional attachments to technologies is a really dominant force in the way the public debate gets constructed. And yet I think, as we probably know, the focus on choosing vehicles and technologies, it's easy because everyone has emotional reactions to vehicles. It's a false analogy with choosing personal vehicles. Most of us have purchased, if not a car, then at least a bicycle, and have some experience of how the look of a particular vehicle connected with us emotionally and connected with something about who we are. For that reason, too, I think it's an especially easy issue for journalists to latch onto. And as a result, journalism in our field often tends to run much too far with the notion of the vehicle choice being the interesting question. But fundamentally, that point of view presumes that people care about the vehicle more than they care about getting where they're going. And when someone is going on about how much they love a vehicle, I have to ask them that question. I have to present that screen. Should we sacrifice people's ability to actually get where they're going in order to pursue this perhaps much more expensive vehicle or more expensive technology? There's a lot of behavior of transit agencies themselves actually reinforces this problem, and I point here to the example. If you get on a tram in Melbourne, Australia, and I lived and worked in Australia for 5 years and still work there about a quarter of the time. If you get on a tram in Melbourne, Australia, what you'll see on the wall of the tram is this map, which is a map of just the tram network. And the implication here is that because I am on a tram, therefore I am a tram person and I am interested in the tram network. Whereas I may just be a person who is on this tram because it goes where I'm going and who actually wants to see an entire network that's useful to me, that shows me my complete capability to move around Melbourne. So the technology attachment becomes very much part of the transit agency communications too, and transit agencies can often inadvertently reinforce the notion that particular technologies are completely separate networks, rather than the notion that I think is much more useful in building ridership, which is that a transit agency's different technologies are all meant to work together as one network to get you to as many places as quickly as possible. So you have this universal question about, is technology a goal or is technology a tool? And I've worked on plenty of studies, including some studies here in Portland, where studies were constructed where the scope of the study basically began with the emotional love of a particular vehicle, basically said, what a cool thing, okay, where should we put it? As opposed to the technology as tool approach, which is what do we need in this corridor? What kind of service capacity, quality do we need to serve transit's essential task? And step two, what vehicle best provides that? Now, it's a little more complicated than this, because we all know, too, that there's lots of data saying that, if you just turn a bus into a streetcar or even a trolley bus and don't change anything else about it, you get some more ridership. I think there's an urgent need for a lot more research about exactly what that response is, and whether when we see those kinds of outcomes, we're really seeing the result of a genuine attachment to the technology, or we're seeing responses to other things that come with it, like sheer legibility. This is why I'm so immensely preoccupied with the urgent need to improve the legibility of bus systems. So, but what is transit's essential task? This turns out to be a really hard question. Well, what's the essential task of police? There are lots of different ways you could answer this question, and people will you can say that the police build confidence in the city as a place to live. They participate in community programs. Police have a very important economic function in providing dramatic content for film, television, and video. And yet, when it comes down to it, there's a pretty broad understanding that those are side effects of policing, and that the actual task of the police is law enforcement. The police go out into the city knowing what their task is, knowing what they are supposed to be delivering, and knowing what they will be judged on delivering. The reality of transit is a little different. What is the essential task of transit? Well, a couple months ago I had the chance to have dinner with a group of leading urban thinkers and transit policy people in Vancouver, BC, which is a city where I do a lot of work. And I asked this question. I said, on analogy to the notion that the core task of the police is law enforcement, what is the core task of transit? In other words, don't just tell me everything, all of the side effects or benefits of transit. Tell me what it is that you expect the transit agency to be doing that delivers those benefits. And this very, very, very smart, deeply reflective, deeply knowledgeable room couldn't answer that question. Nobody had an answer. So what I heard instead were, again, the reiteration of these benefits. And what tends to happen a great deal in transit, and it's one of the major things that wastes a lot of effort, is that because the patrons and advocates of these different outcomes don't understand how much they have in common, and don't understand how much those different outcomes can be served by transit doing a single job, they tend to come at transit agencies separately, demanding different indicators, and so transit agencies feel pulled in different directions. And in particular, transit agencies feel compelled to spend a lot of time almost symbolizing, or at least spending a lot of time presenting and justifying the way they are serving a particular need. Because if a particular need is your entire universe, if, for example, you're exclusively focused on social justice and social inclusion, then, of course, you would expect the transit system to be quite substantially different from what it probably actually is. It's in response to this problem that I wanted to throw out one possible answer to the question, which is that it may be that the essential task of transit is to provide abundant access. And that might actually be the title for another book. Transit provides abundant access without personal vehicles over distances too far to walk. And it's important to pause right here and remember that when I use the word abundance, I actually mean the same thing as efficiency. And transit agencies in particular, I think, one of the things I tend to do is offer a lot of slogans that arise out of this work that transit agencies can use in explaining their own work. And one of these is the notion that efficiency is the same thing as abundance. And I say this often because I'm used to being the person in the room, excuse me, who is having to say that what someone is proposing is just totally inefficient, and that we need to find a more efficient solution to the problem. And someone else in the room inevitably says that that shows that I am a heartless, soulless bean counter who has no comprehension of the human experience or of the lived experience of cities. And so I always have to say that no, given a fixed budget, and there will always be some fixed budget, one hopes that we will in the future have budgets that are much higher, but given any fixed budget, efficiency and abundance are the same thing. And that therefore, in pursuing, if we pursue efficiency, because we are pursuing abundance. Abundant access, of course, means not just more for me or for everyone, but for the most abundance for the most people, the ability to maximize the abundance in the greatest possible number of lives. That inevitably means, as we all know, that great transit systems are unfair in the sense that if you live in a low-density area, your subjective experience of transit is going to have to be less abundant than if you live in a high-density area because of what the fundamental significance of density for all of transit's outcomes. It's important to say without personal vehicles, because one of the things the urban designers often miss is that transit is a fountain of pedestrians. Transit is the thing that delivers pedestrians beyond their walking range as pedestrians. One of the reasons I'm a transit advocate is that I hate hassling with bicycle locks and so on, and I love the experience of arriving into a new place as a pedestrian immediately free to go directly into the experience of that place. And which is, to say nothing against cycling, which is an important part of the mix, but that we do something very important in transit by transporting pedestrians as pedestrians. And urban designers need to recognize that when we're providing a high-intensity service into a location, even if it's a bus service that they don't think is very pretty, we are in fact delivering a fountain of pedestrians. And pedestrians are supposed to be the very foundation of urban design and the foundation of what we recognize as the basis of prosperity in any sort of urban setting. Finally, I think it's important to emphasize over distances too far to walk. A key to transit's efficiency and hence abundance, and this is why, of course, bus rapid transit is so important, but why I think speed and reliability is so important generally, is that transit needs to have a synergistic relationship with walking. That is to say, transit needs to be complementing walking rather than competing with walking. And here the interesting point is that North American stops, setting aside for a moment BRT, and rapid transit solutions, which are wonderful, what we think of as local stop transit service in North America tends to have an average spacing of around 200 meters, 600 feet. Actually, toward the high end. Many are much, much closer. In both Europe and Australia, you'll discover that ordinary local stop spacing is almost twice that. It's around 400 meters, 1,200 feet, or what we would call, or what Americans might call a quarter mile. Now, that means that transit in those cities, in its ordinary local product, is much more consciously not competing with walking. It is running faster, and as a result, being worth walking further to. We already know that that's the recipe for success in VRT or in other kinds of rapid transit, that people walk further to faster service because that could be a logical way of optimizing a total trip time. But it applies to local service too. And I think it's always important to point out that our history of putting stops very close together in North America is simply a North American habit. It has no abstract justification. It simply is the habit that we've inherited. And although, of course, respacing stops is a great political battle, it can be done, especially if it's done as a matter of consistent policy, rather than one by one. And I would point to San Francisco's transit effectiveness program as an example of an attempt to construct a citywide policy that enables transit to move forward on spacing stops citywide consistently. But what if we could see our own access? One of the things I think that is a crucial problem in the transit industry, and it may be a cause of enormous amounts of waste of time and effort, is that we don't have a very good way of getting ordinary people to see the positive impacts of a transit proposal. Negative impacts are immediate and obvious. Positive impacts are abstract and often very hard for an ordinary person to grasp. There's also and so I come back to these isochronic travel time maps as being quite possibly an absolutely crucial tool for a couple of things that we need to do now in the transit industry and a couple of next steps. And I think it's very urgent that applications of this kind of isochron mapping become broadly available. This is simply a map. Walkscore.com produces this, where you plot your location down, and here I've chosen downtown Portland, Oregon, and it shows you isochrones. At the bottom is a slider bar which indicates what time of day you've selected, and it shows you the isochrones that indicate how far you can get in a particular amount of time on transit plus walking. 15, 30, 45 minutes are the three isochrone units. Now my point is that this isn't just some sort of abstract geeky thing for transit people. This is actually a map of freedom. And we need to use those evocative words when they are true. And this is true in that when we think about freedom in the domain of transport, what we really mean is the ability to go many different directions right now, to go several different, to do any of several different things. And in particular, I contend, we mean spontaneity. The ability to spontaneously change an itinerary at any time, the ability to not even think of yourself as having an itinerary, is crucial to what cars provide, and is crucial to what we generally understand as being freedom as expressed in the domain of transport. So I think these maps are evocatively very important, and I want to get to the point I think we need to get to the point very quickly where everybody can call these maps up for their own transit system to understand their own options, and also in the future as a way of evaluating alternative options that are being presented to the public. Right now, we go through a process where frequently the public can't understand the mobility improvements that a proposed project is providing, especially if it's a rather decentralized thing like a network restructuring rather than just a single corridor. And so we end up with all this negative feedback that's very real and visceral, and positive feedback that's very abstract. We have to change that balance, and that balance can be changed by making the positive benefits of transit more viscerally evident, as I think these isochrone maps do. Now, the other purpose of these maps, of course, is to help you make a smart location about where to locate something, and if this map were widely available and realtors and everyone else were pointing people to this tool, then there would no longer be any excuse for locating a senior center in a transit inaccessible location and then yelling at the transit agency because there's no service there. Because you would have been very clear when you made your location decision that you were choosing a certain level of transit mobility. So here, for example, I plot if I choose to locate an office, say, in downtown Portland, this is the range where I can get to easily. This is how many employees can get to me easily. And it's not just how many, but exactly where they're from, which neighborhoods are important to me as places I'm likely to want to connect with. And then I can plot my dot down in perhaps a bit of cheaper real estate further out on the east side, but still in a dense urban grid. And I see that I get these kinds of outcomes. And I can plop it down in a leafy, low-density suburb, and I see that I get a very different kind of outcome. Very easy way for anyone to immediately understand the transit consequences of where they choose to locate so that they can make responsible, informed decisions, which is theoretically a very conservative value, right? Personal responsibility. So what if transit's task were to grow these blobs for the greatest number of people? So not just the area, but the amount of stuff in them. What is the percentage of the city's jobs, nightclubs, parks, etc., can I get to in 15 or 30 minutes? how much of the city in all its richness is available to me, it's possible out of this kind of analysis to get to numbers that not only become things that you could aggregate over a region to objectively describe the access benefit of a particular project, but also that can be described very viscerally. For example, when we talk here about percentages, well, a percentage is a two-digit number, and there's a potential there to get down to a two-digit transit score, if you will, that would be much more meaningful and factual than the aggregated transit scores that WalkScore produces right now, for example. Now, the other thing I say a lot to transit agencies, and this is very important, and this is really one of the core ideas of the book, is that we need to listen to our tools, and we need to explain to our elected masters that transit planners, transit agencies are working with a particular tool, and like any other tool, it requires us to ask certain questions and not others. The history of most of what I've seen in the way of the way elected officials try to govern transit and the way staff try to deal with them is that elected officials adopt goals that they have wordsmithed that make sense to them, but that may or may not actually give staff direction that makes it possible to implement them, because they may not answer the questions that actually need to be answered. I explain to elected officials instead that you need to understand that transit is a craft just like gardening or carpentry. And if you engage in those kinds of crafts, what you realize right away is that this material doesn't care about what your big vision is. It doesn't care about just, this carpentry or gardening isn't just about you having a great idea and willing it into existence. Carpentry or gardening are processes of interaction with a tool in which the nature of the tool requires you to make certain decisions, and the creativity and the success lie in your ability to interact with the tool and respond to the demands as the tool presents them, right? And so an elected official who just blasts through and says, I want this outcome and I don't care how you do it, is not well-serving his staff, but more importantly, his staff has probably not well-served him if he feels that that's now the only way he can communicate because he hasn't been asked the real questions. It would be like going through and telling blasting through a garden and telling your gardener that you want this plant over there and then leaving, and the gardener sits there thinking, well, this plant will die over there. That's not the right light for it. And, you have not given useful direction. So what I argue in the book is that the public transport tool, as we understand it geometrically, asks us certain questions about our goals. Geometrically inevitable questions, and that these are the questions that policymakers need to be thinking about and answering on the level of policy. So one of the examples is connections or complexity. It is a geometric fact that you can either have a network based on connections, also called transfers in America, and that also buys you networks that are frequent and multi-destinational and therefore very resilient and versatile. But if you aren't willing to embrace connections, then what you're going to get is complexity and lower frequency as more and more routes have to overlap to go various directions. This is a geometric fact, and it needs to be explained that clearly. The same with the peak or all-day question. Many transit agencies think peak first. Other transit agencies think all day first. And there isn't and it's common for transit agencies to get stuck in the habit of thinking one way, even as things are changing toward the other. Most common, so given a particular peaking pattern, everybody has one. The question is, do you think of the peak as your main product, and that then there's something called the off-peak or midday in between them? Or do you think of the all-day network as your product, the thing that continues through the peaks, and the peaks as something that you add on top of them? That's a crucial mental shift. And what frequently happens in suburban transit agencies especially, that are used to being overwhelmingly peaked, overwhelmingly oriented toward the commute into the city, or often, too, agencies that are just now, in cities that are just now growing to a size where urban life as we know it is beginning and all-day transit demand is starting to appear, often lag in understanding that they need to start changing their frame of reference from the peak first-oriented thinking to the all-day oriented thinking. But really, this is also a value judgment. It's a question that you need to consciously think about. Ridership or coverage. Density is the overwhelming determinant of ridership because of the way it defines the size of the market around each stop. You can find lots and lots of confusing studies about density that seem to contradict this observation, and it's inevitably because they've studied the issue at the wrong scale. They have, for example, looked at aggregate densities of large areas, compared them to ridership or mode share for those large areas, and come to the conclusion that density doesn't matter that much. To understand the relationship between density and ridership, you actually have to study it right around the stop, very fine-grained. And once you do that, the relationship is overwhelming. The reality is that the market of transit is mostly a fixed radius. A fixed radius means a fixed area, and the amount of stuff in a fixed area is the literal meaning of the word density. So it is really the heart of transit demand, even though, as we know, lots of other things matter. Now, what that implies in a city which has a mixture of many different kinds of densities is that we have to choose between the extent to which we focus on a high ridership network and the extent to which we focus on a coverage network. And I think most transit agencies understand this instinctively. Most transit agencies have a ridership goal of some kind, often a productivity goal, and then they also have a goal that says something like such and such a percent of the population shall be within such and such distance of service. And that's a coverage policy. It is in competition with the ridership policy. It is in conflict with the ridership goal. Because if you didn't have that policy, you would design your network like a business, so to speak. You would concentrate on your strongest markets. You wouldn't serve your weakest markets, and that's the way you'd maximize your ridership. We don't do that because we have a competing goal, which is coverage, which ties to social inclusion concerns and also ties to simply the self-interest of low-density area constituents. So every transit agency is actually balancing these goals, finding a point of equilibrium. I recommend, and I've worked with several agencies to do this, that you do this explicitly, that you have a conversation that elected boards need to be engaged in the fact that this really is a fundamental policy question, and that if they answer this question on the level of policy, if they say, for example, that 75% of our operating budget is to chase ridership wherever it is, and we'll use the other 25%, say, for coverage, for filling in coverage everywhere else. They suddenly give their staff a clear direction that the staff can document back to them that they've complied with, and as a result, this is the way you start taking these awful cycles of second guessing and anxiety out of the staff-board relationship in transit agencies, and start creating more transparency and clarity, because the elected officials finally begin to see that they have in front of them a dashboard where there are knobs that they can turn that reflect real trade-offs that have actual effects. And a lot of the reason why elected officials frequently act out and do destructive things is because they realize they don't have a dashboard, they don't know what the levers are, they don't know what they control. They sit through endless meetings that are about, the need to replace the bus washing equipment, and they never feel like there's a moment where they are actually controlling something. I've actually had some success with this methodology. Reno, Nevada, for example, the Reno Area Transit Agency has a policy now built into its RTP. I worked with them on that in 2005. That states a particular percentage split between these two goals as the policy. And every time a service plan is done of any kind, it is documented back to the board showing compliance with that policy. This is an easy way, too, to save so much grief with the public. Because suddenly when Mrs. Smith from a low-density area calls in angrily because she doesn't have enough bus service, you can explain to her that it is absolutely obvious that you are not picking on Mrs. Smith or on any particular neighborhood. You're implementing a consistent policy all over your network. So the interesting thing is, if you think about just those three questions, and there are several others, although there are valid reasons to be anywhere on the spectrum, and they are in fact value judgments, if you want the sort of urban network that we tend to find when we're traveling in European cities, the kind of network that is frequent and simple and easy to navigate in all directions, this tends to be the result of a particular set of choices. It tends to be a result of planning for ridership more than coverage, for all-day service rather than peak first service, and for connections rather than complexity and the single-seat ride. This, too, is a fact of geometry. And it's very important, I find, when talking to people to stress when I'm talking about a geometric fact as opposed to, say, a cultural fact, because geometry has your back. Geometry is not going to change. and elected officials know that even they, in all of their great power, are not going to change the facts of geometry. Let me just end with a very brief note about what all this means for urban design. In my view, if I had to define transit-oriented development in a single phrase, I would say the definition is high-demand development located on a straight line between other high-demand development, or potentially off the end of something that can continue to be a straight line. This is very different from the way the architecture and urbanism fields presented. I will actually be in Florida later this month for the Congress of the New Urbanism, and I'll be chatting with them about exactly this, and I'm sure that'll be a lively conversation because they tend not to care that much often about actually what makes transit work well. I think this graph is probably pretty obvious to anyone who's ever worked around transit, but it's surprisingly rare to hear it actually explained to people. The principle is pretty simple, that a successful transit line is one that connects many destinations so that it serves multiple different kinds of markets, and that connects these destinations along something that feels like a reasonably straight line such that it is an attractive path between any two of those points. One of the basic reasons why subways seem so efficient is that they go through intermediate points without being slowed down by them. And this is one of the great problems of surface transit, where we try to penetrate some kind of existing center with surface transit, and all the urban designers are inevitably telling us that we have to drive 10 miles an hour through their center, thereby effectively wrecking the ability to connect more distant points. Obviously, the essence of toxicity to transit is the be on the way principle. The essence of toxicity to transit is the cul-de-sac on any scale. Whether you're just talking about a big box that's set back a quarter mile from the street, whether you're talking about a hospital or a university that's maybe a mile up from the street, up on the end of a little drive up to a little hilltop where it feels set back and isolated. Each of those development choices it needs to be understood as a clear statement that you do not want or value high quality transit, because what a cul-de-sac means is that either we have to deviate services to serve you, thereby wrecking the attractiveness of the line for other purposes, or else you're going to get only as much service as you can justify all by yourself. Because a line that serves you can't then go on to serve anyone else. Just to wrap up with a quick example of how easy it is to make this mistake, Peter Calthorpe, designing one of the earliest transit-oriented developments in a greenfield site. This is Laguna West south of Sacramento, designed in the late 80s. Anyone who knows transit-oriented development will recognize this classic design: density around a transit stop in the upcenter of the image, and then densities falling away gradually away from it. This transit today, Laguna West looks like this. The town center never built out. What you basically have is all of the single-family neighborhoods built out, and what we have is essentially a single-family, car-dependent neighborhood where all of the streets are named for architects. What went wrong? Well, many things went wrong, but one of the most obvious things that went wrong was that the designer thought he could decide where the transit stop went. He was, as is common, had this notion that buses are quote-unquote flexible, and that if he just puts a town center somewhere, that therefore it will automatically have good service. And what he did was to put the town center between two logical transit corridors, but not on any logical transit corridor. In this case, he was well out from the city, so there wasn't a lot of existing transit to work with. But he could have recognized that at this point, the primary demand flows are going to be north-south, and that by situating himself between two possible north-south corridors rather than on any one of them with his town center, he effectively made his development a cul-de-sac. And that's the ultimate point. It is very easy to inadvertently create a transit-oriented development in a cul-de-sac in a way that ensures you will never have good transit if you're not careful. Another simple example of a basic thing that I'm always pointing out. Question the T pattern. Whenever you see a T pattern in a route network map, notice that there's something tricky about that. Notice especially that if you see a proposed network map with three segments meeting in a T like this, you can be almost sure that something important is missing. Consider, for example, the San Francisco Airport BART extension. The San Francisco Airport BART extension south from San Francisco takes the form of a triangle. It was built early in the last decade, And during the 1990s, when it was being argued about, we were endlessly shown the diagram on the left, which made it look like San Francisco Airport, Millbrae, which is the gateway station for the San Francisco Peninsula, and San Francisco were all going to be directly connected to one another. And if you're thinking like a motorist, this looks fine. It looks like a complete set of roads. Transit, however, can't actually do that. Transit will only do one of the things on the right because of the simple fact that branching divides frequency. The reason, and so what happened was that a piece of infrastructure got built that made perfect sense to all of the people who were mostly personal motorists, quite frankly, who were in the position to make this decision. But it has never operated very well, and nobody is happy with it because it is actually inoperable. And it is inoperable because a very, very basic geometry mistake was made, which was that the design didn't acknowledge the fact that branching will divide frequency. And so you have a situation now where either too much frequency needs to be run into San Francisco in order to get a decent frequency to either of the branches, or else you have to serve one of the branches on the way to the other. It's funny, for several years I was flying into San Francisco Airport once a year. Each time I would get on BART, and each time they were running this in a different pattern, as though they were just squirming around in a chair that was never going to be comfortable. That means, too, if you want transit to work, quit building things like this. Urban designers are very enamored of T-intersections right now, but they're toxic to transit because transit can't branch both directions at once without losing frequency. You end up having to run lots of overlapping lines to serve these kinds of patterns. But on the other hand, there's another kind of suburban sprawl development that's actually very good for transit, and that's the typical, what we would call the straight line sprawl arterial, with commercials sort of spread along it on both sides. And the reason for that is that it's a straight line with lots of major destinations on it. And the point I have to make about the suburban arterial and the great opportunity there is that it's not just, yes, the existing walkability of the environment is disastrous, but far more important, underlying that, the geometry is very good. The geometry is actually perfect for what transit lines need to succeed, which is to be able to run straight over a long distance, connecting lots of points of interest, lots of major destinations. And I actually contend, we can talk about this more if you like, that the needs of transit in the suburban arterial are actually the key to coming up with an appropriate way to heal the suburban arterial and to recreate it as a civilized environment. Thank you.
Well, Jarrett, thank you very much. I've always enjoyed hearing you talk, reading your blog. You take nothing at face value. You're not bound by tradition, and I think you always look at circumstances with a fresh pair of eyes. For instance, when you're talking about when you look at a transit map, every transit route that's on the map tends to look alike in terms of its thickness, as if each one of them provided equal service, but that's hardly the case. That it would be like having a road map where an expressway would be shown the same as a dirt road. And these sort of observations are just very, very helpful as we talk with our policy boards. And I just wanted to thank you on behalf of the industry for providing those kind of original insights.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jennifer, could you remind our listeners how they can ask their questions? Nope. Jennifer must have stepped out for just a moment.
I'm here, Joel. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
On the screen, but please click Q&A in the top menu bar. Type in your question and click Ask. And it looks like we do have a couple of questions, Joel.
Right. I see that the first one is a request for some information on the isochrome map. If you could, Jarrett, please provide who is the provider of those isochrome maps. They couldn't hear it quite clearly.
I will, while I'm sitting here, I'll pull up the USB and just stick it into the chat there myself. I'll find the web address for it and just stick it into the chat myself for you. I'll look for it right now while we're talking, so we can continue, and that will show up in the chat window in a moment. All
right, thank you. Next question is that your book focuses on optimizing transit networks and serving higher density land uses. However, since our cities have been built for the auto, transit lacks the public support it needs to expand service. How can transit best serve lower density areas and thus appeal to more people?
I think the transit has to, that's a very, very different question in each different city. There is yes, it is necessary often to bring people who live in low density areas into a conversation about transit, and inevitably they need a certain amount of service in return, or at least they need to feel like some kind of important civic objective is being met. That's often part of it. You have to make decisions right away about to what extent what you're going to claim to be a transformative thing that is an instrument of environmental or sustainability benefits, or to what extent you're going to present yourself as a social service. That the latter can certainly work, can certainly be a way of doing it. For example, the Salem area transit district here in Oregon, when it had to go to its voters for a funding increase just to keep going, used the slogan, "Someone you know needs the bus." And that worked, because it was true that almost everyone did know someone who knew someone who knew someone for whom the bus system was very important. But in terms of how you approach that, I would say that there are almost no universal rules that I'd want to declare from a height. I'd really want to sit down with your city and look at your particular situation to see how you would approach that. I do think that it is important to have a very broad conversation. It's important to listen, to do a lot of listening, not just about do we want this transit system or not. It's a very important thing. Don't get too quickly to the binary question of should we do this or not. Spend a lot more time in the public conversation on why, on what are the purposes that a transit system might serve, how important are these purposes to people. Learn how to draw the little map of influences that flows from the various deeply held values that people do have, the things that people do want, and how those imply a transit system, and help make that logic visible to people. That's how you bring people along. I guess the other important thing I would emphasize is that you will almost certainly have a noisy, belligerent, bullying opposition, and they mostly deserve to be ignored. It's important to accept that there's, in this country, obnoxious bullying opposition to almost everything, and that is a lot more noise than it is actual power. And I think one of the greatest challenges that transit staffs have generally is to not respond to sheer noise, but to really pay attention, do the work of understanding what the average citizen, what the broad population really does feel about an issue.
Okay. The next question or point was someone that said, great presentation. Given that I am in the Denver area, could you provide any insights on how to connect the local bus service you have talked about with rail service? I assume you may be familiar with our fast track system of largely radial rail routes focused on the CBD. So the basic question is,
I'm broadly familiar with fast tracks. I think a better frame of reference is to say a city needs a complete rapid transit network. A city needs a complete network of logical major corridors that do not stop very frequently and that therefore run relatively fast. And some of those will be rail, and some of them will probably be bus rapid transit. But if your frame of reference is focused on the rail versus bus distinction, if that's how you categorize services, you'll miss a lot of opportunity on the bus side, because buses are also entirely capable of creating light rail-like services that provide additional crucial links in the network. Having said that, integration, the design of bus services around rail services, and sometimes vice versa, is very important work. I've done a great deal of it. Bus networks do need to be substantially redesigned as rail networks open. And but the redesign has to be understood as more than just creating feeders to rail. Very common mistake, where you have a common attitude is we have this great exalted rail system and the lowly buses should now feed it. That's not really the relationship, because buses need to create a complete network for all kinds of purposes, where they're feeding rail in addition to doing a lot of other things, because remember, that's the point of the be on the way principle. A bus route that does lots of different things is the really successful bus route, not just something that does one. So those are some of the principles that come to that kind of design. It's something I've done a great deal, but I wouldn't try to say much more about it from this distance.
Okay. A somewhat similar question here. The person says, I, too, always enjoy your talks and blog. Let me go back to your point about vehicle technology choices. Here in Utah, people are always wanting more rail instead of what the best transit choice is. How do we get the community to get away from first thinking about the vehicle choices and think more about transit network choices? I could go on with many people here in Utah, many examples here in Utah.
Of course. And I think I think the Salt Lake area is actually doing some pretty impressive things. But the short answer to your question is those travel time maps. And by the way, I had picked up the URL for the travel time maps, but the question that I was answering disappeared, so I'm not sure how to put it out there. I assume that can be mailed out afterward or something. But if you think about those travel time maps, remember that they are silent about mode. They're silent about technology. The whole premise of that travel time isochron map is that even more than you love being on a train as opposed to a bus, even more than that, you love to get where you're going. That's the premise. And when you put it that way, the conversation starts changing. But that's how it has to be put. You have to create something out there that is as exciting and that people can play with themselves, and that is as exciting as the vehicle. One of the interesting things about the Portland streetcar, for example, is that although its scheduled average speed is now under 7 miles an hour, it still has one of those aerodynamic noses that's meant to symbolize speed. And what that tells me is that although the streetcar is primarily a symbol, speed is still something that people want, or we wouldn't be symbolizing it like that, right? There's a reason we're doing that, and it's because travel time does still matter. Now, the aerodynamic nose on a streetcar that goes under 7 miles an hour is a perfect example of a purely symbolic choice. It has no impact whatsoever on the performance of the vehicle. And so it's a nice way to understand that this is a case where because we can't understand the reality of what we want, we are spending a lot for a symbol of what we want. And I think the whole issue of symbolic transit is very interesting and something that much more needs to be done on.
Okay. Next question is that although the examples you showed are toxic to transit, they do exist. What do you do? Also, how do you feel the recent Title VI ruling came out, and how will it impact low-density areas?
I have to admit I'm not familiar with the Title VI ruling, and that's not a space that I've been working in particularly recently, so I apologize for not being across that. The general question about what you do with existing areas is that you sit down with stakeholders who care about those areas, and you work them gently through reality. So, for example, one tool I often use is that has worked very well in places like that, is that I will run a stakeholder workshop where I'll bring some key stakeholders out of those areas, put them around a table, give them a map of their area, and invite them to draw transit lines themselves. But I'll give them the tools necessary to quickly cost the lines that they're drawing so that they have the experience of working with some kind of budget. Simply sitting them down for an hour and making them think about that is transformative, because then they discover the geometry problem that their development has presented. And once they discover the problem, it becomes clear that yelling at the transit agency is not going to solve their needs, because there is a geometry problem about the way their development is built. And that in turn leads to Well, I don't say it leads immediately to harmony. The initial message is certainly not what they want to hear. But cooler heads at least start getting it. And you start turning the conversation away from the rage and away from feelings that you're just picking on us out here because, you know, we're the wrong ethnicity or you don't like us or whatever. And helping them realize instead that it is a geometry problem that they're up against.
Mm-hmm.
Once you make it a geometry problem, a lot of rational people that'll break through to a lot of rational people and realize, okay, this is not the transit agency doing something to me, and that's really the gateway.
Right. You know, speaking of the geometry, you had a slide up there earlier about a network that had vehicles going everywhere, crisscrossing, et cetera, versus one that was really kind of focused on a transfer center that allowed people to make connections anywhere in the city, but of course would require the transfer, which typically people say, well, we don't really want to transfer. But could you tell us what your experience has been when you present those different scenarios and whether or not they would say, well, all right, transferring is not so bad after all?
My experience has been that I have not had the tools to do this properly because, as I said, I've not had the tools necessary to make the positive benefits of such a restructuring vivid and clear. That's why I think do-it-yourself travel time mapping tools that you can play with at home in your pajamas to understand better what's being proposed and how it will affect you are really crucial. Because otherwise, especially when you're doing bus network restructuring, everybody who's negatively impacted screams at once, and elected officials panic, and it's very, very difficult. And a lot of urgently needed restructurings are not moving forward for that reason. Having said that, I have moved a lot of restructurings forward. I have to say, honestly, that as somebody who lives in a fairly green hippie enclave like Portland, Oregon, it's actually a lot easier if you have some conservatives around, because it's good to have a mix of political ideologies on the board, because it helps because when you're on that kind of board, you're required to present your views in several different terms, right? Instead of just hitting a single hot button that you can expect to move an entire board or council. And so the interesting thing is that, assuming that the people are at least courteous to each other, those boards are often much better able to actually look through a difficult decision and understand the actual trade-off. And it's a hard choice for conservatives too, because it's usually their constituents that you're abandoning when you pull out of low-density or unproductive areas. On the other hand, they're the ones who care most about cost recovery and so on. So it's an interesting debate, but it is something that you can facilitate. The only place where I found it really difficult, quite frankly, is in cities with no conservatives at all, places like Seattle and San Francisco, where where it really becomes remarkably difficult to get focused on efficiency issues in the conversation. And with all due respect to any people from those cities listening, I love you all. You're wonderful cities. But that is an interesting issue. And what I really want to say is, if you have a lot of conservatives around, that may actually be a good thing for transit in some respects.
Okay. And I was interested in the comments you made about the distance between bus stops in the United States versus Europe and other countries. And this question is, what is your opinion on the maximum distance that a user might be willing to walk to a transit stop?
It's a complicated question because what a user really wants to do is optimize their total travel time. That means they'll walk further to a faster service if they're going further. They'll walk less if they're going a shorter distance. Now, so you really have to have a debate about, are you really ready to say that transit is no longer about competing with walking? And of course, that's a very tough conversation with your senior citizens who have a very different disincentive to walking than everyone else. But if you're ready to have that conversation, that's what leads to pushing stops further apart, because what you're saying then is that at least your mainline transit services are intending to compete for a longer trip distance, therefore overlapping walking less, complementing walking more. And based on that decision, if you can get to that, understand how that connects to all of your sustainability outcomes. If you get to that, then yes, then it is logical that you would put stops further apart, because people who are optimizing their total travel time and who are going a fairly long distance, it becomes logical for them to walk a little further to a service that will move them more rapidly.
Right. No, well put.
I guess one other point I have to make on this, you have to do this as a agency-wide policy. You cannot do this stop by stop. The worst possible thing is you can say, let's try doing this on one line and see how it works politically. That's the worst way to do it because one particular area feels picked on. It's got to be the implementation of a network-wide policy.
Mm-hmm. Although sometimes there might be an example you want to put out there. For instance, in Portland, they did do that on one line, and they reduced, I think, about 6% of the stops, and they found that their route could be finished 6% faster and avoided expenses associated with having to put additional equipment on and made everybody's ride a little bit quicker. And then they could say, well, see, it works, and maybe we should do this in more places.
Right.
Another question for you on a practical note. We are really struggling with the ridership coverage dilemma in Sarasota, Florida. Our county has a dense northern area and a low-density, spread-out southern area. Our politicians represent these different geographic territories and demand service for the low-density areas despite deteriorating ridership and low-fare revenue. How can we paint a picture of a more successful transit system for them to create with their policy choices?
This is one of the toughest things for staff to do. Present them with the real question and step back. Don't try to express a view yourselves as staff about what the trade-off between ridership and coverage should be. Instead, let me tell you quickly what I would do if I were your consultant in this situation. I would come in to your board. We'd set up a board workshop. I would present them with a map that says, if high ridership, if high fare box return, if minimum subsidy were our total objective, this is what your network would look like. And it would show all your service in one end of the county, right? Mm-hmm. And then I would present a map that says, if universal coverage, if serving everyone were your objective, here's what your network would look like. And it would be a much weaker network, much fainter, more ephemeral lines reaching into every corner of the county. And I might also draw some intermediate points. I might also describe what a 50-50 network might look, or a 70-30 one way or the other. And I would say, and I would describe some outcomes of these. And then I would say, which of these is closest to what you as a board could agree on as the policy agency? You're not adopting these networks. These networks are just illustrations of the policy. But the policy question is, how much of your budget do you want to spend optimizing ridership, minimizing subsidy, and so on? How much of your budget do you want to spend on an intrinsically high subsidy social service expenditure, essentially, which is about driving around low-density suburbs at low demand times? And in the context of that, you can talk through all the other elements, like, to some extent you can run a high ridership park and ride-based service out of your low-density areas because you aren't actually driving around the local areas. That can be one way. But you also need to have someone there who will very firmly steer people away from all the things they will try to do to get out of the box of having to answer that question. They'll inevitably ask me about flexible services, and wouldn't flexible services somehow solve this problem? No, it doesn't. I can talk you through why it doesn't. They're a great thing. They help in a lot of situations, but they don't get you out of answering this question. I take the view the real job of an elected official is to answer exactly these kinds of questions because they have no technical truth. This is an answer about what your community values. And the hardest thing for staff to do, but it's exactly what staff needs to do, is to frame the question in such a way that the electeds understand that this is the kind of question that only they can answer, and then sit back and let your board figure it out. That really is the only way we get there, and it's the only way we've gotten there. And the electeds will squirm, but, I'll tell a quick funny story about this. Once when I was running exactly this kind of process, we were on a break, and I was in the men's room, and one of the elected officials came up to me at the adjacent urinal, and he just leaned over to me and said, Jarrett, I know you don't want to say anything out there, but really, what do you think we should do? And I said, well, I'm a consultant. I'm not going to tell you what your values are. The whole point of this exercise is that this is unequivocally a value judgment. There is no technical answer. You, the elected leaders of this city, need to tell us what you want. And if you tell it to us in this form, we can actually implement it. So that's really what it comes down to. You got to put elected officials to work. And the interesting thing is, if you give elected officials the tools to actually see their choices, give them the dashboard, which is what this whole approach is about. Give them the clear dashboard. They will start taking responsibility for the fact that now, yes, they're the board. Now they see the choice. They have to work this out themselves.
Okay, thanks. One last question. How do you view the potential contribution of bike sharing and car sharing to transit? That is, removing some of the cul-de-sacs, expanding the reach of transit, etc.
I am all for all of those sharing tools. My belief is that when we're talking about the world of actually encouraging sustainable lifestyles, when we're actually encouraging low car or no car lifestyles, which is not what we're doing everywhere in the city, but where we're doing that, a whole suite of alternatives is needed. In addition to transit, you have to have car sharing. You have to have good bicycle facilities. Bike sharing is often a part of that. That's also often a very easy thing for tourists to use. So all of that suite of options is very important. If I focus on transit, it's mainly because transit is such a complex, it's not that complex, but it's a thing that really has to be gotten right on its own terms. And then it becomes very easy, yes, to add all of those other features in ways that work well with it and that serve basically the same neighborhoods that transit is also trying to serve with really high quality mobility.
Mm-hmm. And actually, one more question came in, and even though we're running a little bit later than normal, it's not surprising. You offer such interesting insights. Here's the question. There are a couple of websites that now offer walkability scores, which uses transit service as the main variable. Do you find any value in these sites?
It depends on how they quantify transit service. And that's probably all I can say in this format. But you have to dig down into how transit service is being evaluated, and then look at that travel time map again. Look at that tool and ask yourself, is this really describing what matters to me? So, for example, my objection to the transit score product, the two-digit number that walkscore.com produces, is that it contains an explicit bias toward rail. It explicitly says that if the service is on rails, you have a higher transit score, even if the access outcomes are exactly the same. And initially that was actually used as a proxy for the speed of the service because they didn't know how to readily identify rapid services in an automated way. That, of course, would be even more absurd because Seattle will soon have a 10-mile-an-hour streetcar and already has plenty of 60-mile-an-hour bus lines. So that is a common element. Also, but generally be suspicious if a bunch of diverse things have been just thrown together and weighted somehow in order to create a score, because it's all in that weighting. And it's a lot like the other things we've been talking about. Inside the way that score was constructed are a lot of other people's value judgments about what's important, which you may not share, and which you are no obligation to share. That's why I keep coming back to things like the access map as a way that you could actually get to a two-digit score that it's ultimately a percentage of how much of the population can get to how much stuff, because that would be an actual fact. And it would not have as much value judgment built into it. It would, however, be a score simply of transit outcomes rather than of secondary attractive features of transit, like features of infrastructure or technology.
Okay. Well, Jarrett, once again, we want to thank you for taking the time today, sharing your thoughts, and inspiring so many questions that we have here. And we look forward to working with you in other capacities in the future. And good luck with your book. And
thanks very much, Joel. Really appreciate it.
Sure. Okay. And go ahead.
Yeah, and please, the book is Human Transit. Anyone who wants to chat with me more about this, especially if you're interested in consulting services, Jarrett at jarrettwalker.com.
Very good. Okay. Well, we ask all of our people that are on the line to just take about 2 minutes, if you would. It's very important for us to get feedback from you so that we know if our presentations are serving your needs, if they're relevant to the jobs you're doing. And some of these are fill in the blank, and then we have some other questions for you that would be looking for a little bit more insight in terms of what was most valuable. And this will help Jarrett as well in any future presentations he might make. So we would appreciate it if all those who are still with us would go ahead and take the survey. Even after we're closed up with our webcast, the survey instrument will still be available to you. And Jennifer, I think we also have an announcement in terms of what the next webcast session will be.
Yes, Joel, the next webcast is actually next Thursday, May 10th, and it's a reschedule from April 19th that will be presented by Christine Williams, and it's the topic is access management and local governments.
Okay, great. And for those who don't know, Christine is probably the national expert on the subject of access issues. So we invite you to attend that session as well. So once again, particularly to our first-time listeners, we really appreciate you joining us. And one more thank you to Jarrett. And hopefully everybody has a good rest of the week.
Thank you, everyone.